Good morning, everyone.
Morning. Morning.
Try it once more.
Morning.
I always sort of cringe when people do this, but I'm going to do it now. Good morning, everyone. There we go. Okay, just it helps to get some feedback. So my name is Winston Thompson. I am an assistant professor of educational studies and associate professor of associate professor of educational studies and associate professor of philosophy by courtesy. I am also a member of the steering committee for the Center for Ethics and Human Values here at Ohio State University. In addition to that, I am this year's coordinator for the COMPAS program. As many of you know, COMPAS, or Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society, is one of the center's core series. And what we do each year is we host a series of events, talks, miniature conferences on a theme. This year's theme, Education in Our Democracy, positions us nicely to pair with one of our other programs in the center, CARE. As many of you know, CARE events promote multidisciplinary and exploratory discussions of cutting-edge issues in the field of research ethics. And in doing so, CARE aims to advance Ohio State's shared values and build a community around the topic of research integrity. So again, as I say, it makes good sense to bring these two series together for today's conversation as we ask questions about the role and the relationship between universities and their community partners, exploring whether or not these relationships and partnerships can pursue justice. Can these be just relationships? So today we're joined by a wonderful constellation of panelists. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction. I was sort of looking over things and trying to figure out where I could cut to kind of make this digestible for everyone, because our panelists have such great resumes. First up, sitting second at the table there, is our invited guest, Professor Ron David Glass, Professor of Philosophy of Education at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Professor Glass currently investigates the ethical issues raised by justice-oriented collaborative research methodologies and has long focused his philosophical work on education as a practice of freedom, ideological transformation, and the role of education and public learning processes in creating a just, pluralistic democracy. Professor Glass's philosophy of practice is rooted in his civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movement experiences and many years of working with aggrieved communities struggling for justice. In addition to Professor Glass, we are joined by OSU's own Professor Timothy San Pedro. Timothy San Pedro is Associate Professor of Multicultural and Equity Studies in Education here at OSU. Professor San Pedro's scholarship focuses on the intricate links between motivation, engagement, and identity construction to curricular and pedagogical practices that refocus content and conversations upon indigenous histories, perspectives, and literacies. He worked with the Native American Next Step program in Arizona to expand Native American subjects and content in Phoenix area schools, as well as led professional development workshops on the Navajo reservation that co-constructed and co-envisioned lessons and pedagogical decisions to sustain and support the cultures of students. Finally, but certainly not least of all, we have with us Professor Taslim Padamsi. Professor Padamsi is Assistant Professor of Health Services Management and Policy here at OSU. Professor Padamsi is a sociologist by training and brings theoretical and methodological tools from sociology and women's studies to bear on public health problems. Her research explores the nexus of social inequality, public policy, and healthcare. Currently, she's involved in a couple of different projects, and I just want to mention that some of her work has focused on how diverse women at elevated risk for breast cancer make prevention decisions, and looking at the effects of these decision-making processes on physical and psychosocial health. In addition, she's also currently doing some work on an in-depth comparative study of how HIV and AIDS policies have been made in the United States and the United Kingdom over the past 30 years. And then moderating and sort of leading us off in this discussion is the Center for Ethics and Human Values' very own Dana Howard. Professor Howard is a philosophy faculty member with a primary appointment in the Ohio State University Center for Bioethics, College of Medicine. Prior to coming to OSU, Professor Howard was a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health. And here at OSU, in addition to the wonderful work that she does leading CARE, she is also a member and colleague of mine on the steering committee for the Center for Ethics and Human Values. So, I ask that you join me in welcoming the members of our panel as we begin this conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's so nice to see people in real life after years of online panels. It's just really wonderful to bring the community together for CARE and for COMPAS. I can't imagine a better question to start our year when it comes to conversations about research ethics, which is really about the role of the university in these partnerships who basically is, for whom the research is valuable and who's bearing the sort of burdens and the labor costs of the research. And I think that a lot of these questions have actually come up in a lot of different CARE panels in the past, and I'm just really excited to have a sustained dialogue about that today with my esteemed panelists. And that is the most I'm going to say today. Everything else is going to be questions. So just to get the ball rolling, I'm just going to ask sort of a broad question, and I'm going to ask Ron to start, and then Tim and Taslim to respond afterwards. And basically, we can all agree by their very structure that the relationships between university researchers and community partners are often marked by deep power imbalances. In your research, and this is also an opportunity to explain what your research is and how you've engaged in community partners in the past, and why you engage in such important work and why it's important to you. So in your research, what are the driving sources of these power imbalances, and how do you work towards forging equitable relationships with community members and organizations, given that some of these power dynamics are beyond your control? And so we'll start with Ron, and then we'll move counterclockwise.
Always good to move in a counter way, I guess, against the dominant. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Well, first I have to start by thanking Winston and Dana and the others for an invitation to be here. It's a real honor to be present here. I feel very lucky to be returning home. I was born here in Columbus. My parents met here at Ohio State, and my mother grew up right at just beyond the corner of 15th Avenue and High Street, and that's where my grandparents lived, and where I used to hang out with my cousins, a couple of them who are sitting back there, still hanging around. The older people in the room, you can identify who we are. But it's really good to be back here and sort of my family home base and the land of the Shawonwaki. And I'm here from the unceded territory of the Muwekma Ohlone folks, the tribe out on, it's known as Berkeley, California to most folks. But it's a real honor to be here and to be able to share a little bit of my experience with you. In terms of the questions that you've been posed to me about these issues of power between the university and communities, there's very, very complex sets of issues, right? Because power gets played out through race and through class, through gender, through language, through money, through time, through the land itself. And none of those power dynamics disappear within the university itself or within communities or within the relationships that we have between researchers and communities. And so given that these issues pervade us, right, it's not like we ourselves are somehow free of racism or sexism or whatever. So my own position is against purity. I'm against purity of any form. There is no ethical purity. The center that I directed for a number of years, it was the University of California system-wide center, the Center for Collaborative Research for an Equitable California, rejected the traditional notion of research ethics that's very kind of transactional, that sees a kind of good and bad binary. And we reject that notion that there's a way to sort of be purely good, right? There's no way to extract ourselves from these inequitable power relationships. And so what that means for me in terms of an ideal relationship with the community, an ethical relationship, is to be upfront about the fact that all of these relationships are ongoing and negotiated. Mm-hmm. Traditional research ethics sees the ethics of research as bracketed at the beginning. Right, as a researcher, you get your research reviewed by the IRB, you have your protocols reviewed, then you get your research subject to sign a release, right? That's consent, so-called informed consent. Once you've done that, your ethical obligations, as far as the IRB is concerned, is pretty much over. Mm-hmm. We reject that notion, right? And we see ethics as pervasive in our human relationships and in our research and in our research partnerships. And so what that means is that we are committed to ongoing negotiations, right? That the ethical issues that arise, whether race or class or gender, they're not at the beginning, they're not at the end, they're throughout. And we take time to deal with those, right? Those are not incidental issues. These are primary issues. So at the Research Center, we identified the work that we were committed to as equity-oriented, community-based, collaborative research. We put equity-oriented in front, right? Because the ethics and the politics of these power relationships, if those aren't up front and dealt with explicitly and in an ongoing way, there's no possibility of a real, true ethical relationship with our community partners. So that's sort of how I'll get us started.
Great.
Wow. Thank you for that grounding. I resonated and connected just deeply on just ethics as relational and ongoing and longitudinal from beginning to end. So I'll just share a little bit about who I am, where I come from, and how that connects to the work that I do, because I think that that's also an ethical consideration that we ought to be thinking through, right? How are our identities, the lenses that we create, our epistemologies, and the ways that we see the world impacting the work that we do and how we interpret that world to others. And so I grew up on the Flathead Indian Reservation in western Montana, homelands of the Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille nations. However, I'm Filipino American, and I'll save that story for another day. But I think it's important to state that in growing up on the reservation, I was and I wasn't constantly. By appearance, by sense of humor, I was included into their culture, into their tribal customs, into their celebrations, all the while knowing that I wasn't. And I think that that's an important distinction to state, who we are and who we are not in the relationships that we enter into. So growing up there and going through a K through 12 education, I saw that the languages, knowledges, customs, and brilliance of my friends and their families from the Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille nations were not represented in schools. It's similar to anybody from a marginalized background in engaging in public education, in seeing that our stories from the home, our stories from communities are rarely, if ever, present within the curriculum in critical and impactful ways. And so, I set out to understand, how we can engage in curriculum and in pedagogy in ways that center students, that center tribal understandings, that center what students bring to the classroom. And so I was in a Native American literature classroom in Arizona. It was an English elective course at the 12th grade level. And they had a significant shift in the curriculum where they asked students, what do we want to learn? What sort of traditions, knowledges do you bring into the classroom, and let's learn about that. And there was a student named Eileen, and she came up to me about halfway through the semester, and she shared with me a story that she had with her father at home, where she said, I've been teaching him about what we've been learning in this classroom. And I found that so impactful. And she said that in that conversation, my father decided that he's only going to speak Dene or Navajo to me in the home to help me practice and understand my language and the cultural significance within the lessons of language. And I thought within that moment how powerful that story was, and how I wanted to be a fly on that wall to hear the conversation between her and her father. Years later, I entered into relations with 5 Native American families from a number of different tribes, from Coast Salish, Wampanoag, Dakota, Lakota, and Yupiaq, to understand the intergenerational lessons that are happening between, in this situation, Indigenous mothers and their children. And within that invitation, there were a lot of ethical considerations. How we enter into these conversations, how we begin to develop relationships with people, to ask questions that are really pressing and on our mind, and how we share who we are in relation to who they are, so that those relationships can begin and grow and flourish. And so we entered into conversation, and I think where I'm going with that is that I was presented with the tribal IRB. So institutions have their own IRB, but the institutional IRBs have failed communities time and time again, right? And so these tribal IRBs, these tribes have taken up ownership of their own IRBs and said, this is what we want from research relationships. This is how you act in the presence of us. This is how you do no harm, and this is how you can benefit what we're doing and enter into partnership with what we're doing. And so most every tribal IRB has 4 ethical principles. One is respect, another is relevance, another is reciprocity, and another is responsibility. And the emphasis of those 4 R's is what they call them. The emphasis of those 4 R's is that we are collaborative in nature, that we walk lightly in the presence of others, that we listen with our hearts first, and that when we collect data and share that data, we do so in ways that honor that relationship. And so I think oftentimes in research relationships, it's stories that I hear, it's how do I get access? And access in ways that mean how do I gather this data and use it for my own purposes, through my own analysis and my own training. And I think we ought to be thinking of a different way of thinking, which is how are the participants, or community members, how are their epistemological stances connecting with my own? And when we share this work outside of each other, are the stories that I interpret and analysis a fair understanding of their interpretation and analysis? And so through that, for me, that means getting closer to the C-O. And what I mean by that is co-analysis, co-writing, collaborating, so that our stories are ones that are crafted and created between us, and not in the absence of another, and forwarding my own epistemological stance. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. I'm Tasleem. It is an honor to be here and humbling. I have learned a lot already. So I really appreciate some of the things I've heard already, in particular resonate with the priority of respect and with putting equity first on the list. And I actually have found that in my own work, the challenge of putting equity first means that a whole lot of other challenges constantly unfold in ethics, in procedures, in questions we ask all over the place. So that's my sort of grounding challenge. I identify as a person of color who also has white privilege. That's because I am half Latina, I'm Puerto Rican and Cuban, and half Indian, and I grew up in a mostly white town in upstate New York with a lot of educational privilege. My parents both had PhDs. My father was a professor and a research professor, and my mother was like a minority affairs kind of staff person. So I spent a lot of time in academic spaces. And I'm very light-skinned, so I walk around the world with white privilege, but not whiteness in my head, if you will. And that affects who I am and how I relate to people in ways that are sometimes feel very helpful and sometimes feel very problematic. But maybe those problems aren't always a bad thing, right? Because they give me an entree into other people's thinking. So I would say that for me, so I think a lot of what I might say today is probably grounded in Winston mentioned a couple of areas of my research. I've been working with Black women who are at high risk for breast cancer. I've been doing a lot of work recently in some of the communities in Ohio that have been hardest hit by COVID. So in places where we've had the highest caseloads, the highest death rates, the highest social and economic upheaval. And trying to work with those communities on understanding those impacts and eventually moving toward interventions to alleviate them, not just around COVID, but the conditions that created them, so that we don't have these same things unfold the next time there's a health crisis. And then I've worked on this a different level with policymakers and people who are trying to influence policy around HIV and AIDS, as you mentioned. In particular, in the breast cancer and the COVID work, I think I've realized that a lot of the sources of the power imbalance are not from the places where I thought that they would come from, which is when I was trained about how to obey the IRB, edicts and therefore be ethical. There was a lot of stuff about, what I shouldn't say and what I should say by way of trying to protect people. A lot of the power imbalance comes from the assumptions that people are making about each other, in my experience. So that is places where I walk into an environment and I use certain types of language. I speak in certain types of words. I construct sentences that have lots of clauses. I use phrases like construct sentences. And these things tip people off in ways that cause, not all the time, because there are certainly communities that I have worked with that have been very articulate about their own requirements for research participation and how that is supposed to be beneficial for their own communities, but there have been many places that are not, where people are genuinely stepping forward to participate in research because they want to be part of solutions to problems that they see in their own communities, and they assume that this can do this, but they also assume that I know stuff that they don't know, maybe because I'm walking into the situation claiming to know something. So the fact that I walk in sometimes already with the power to articulate the problem and to frame the issue is part of the power dynamic from day one that has to be undone. And sometimes that's harder work than others. Sometimes my community partners are like pushing back against it as soon as I get there, but sometimes they're not. And that undoing that takes a lot of time, and I'm sure we can talk about it more, but for me, I think that the lesson here is back to something that Ron said about negotiation over time in an ongoing way that helps to resolve these problems and put us on a different kind of footing where we are having a joint negotiation over where we're going and what our findings tell us and what they mean. So I'll stop.
Thank you so much. So before I move on, I'll just say I have two more questions and then start thinking about questions that you want to ask the panelists. I'm going to jump to the time question, so the third question. Basically, it's like we've heard so much about like what it takes to engage in equitable community university partnerships, and that takes time. And this has been something that has come up also in previous CARE panels. It also takes resources, right? And one thing that you've mentioned in your work, Ron, is also the sort of way in which universities are not only research institutions, but they're educational institutions. And so part of what you're doing is you're training the next generation of researchers. So what do we do with students and sort of junior researchers and the way in which the time and trusts that is required to develop within community engaged research is not on the same timeline as potential the academic timeline, the grants timeline, the IRB, the IRB timeline. So this is just an opportunity to ask the three of you what structural features, either regarding funding, tenure, promotion, publication, access to resources. I mean, this is like a big question, which is annoying. But do you feel stop you and other researchers that are invested in justice-oriented work from engaging and with participants in communities in equitable ways? And maybe we'll go this way this time. So we'll start with Ron, and then Teslim, you could go next.
Me?
You're next.
Okay. So time, resources, students. Yes. Who has the time to do any of this, right? And what time is it anyway? Whose time are we in? Right. One of the things that we think about within the projects that I do is that we live in many times and in many places simultaneously. And the time and place that we are have different ethical valences for different folks. Right. So how the places where we are named has different kinds of impacts depending on your life history, your people's history. So the first thing that we have to think about with time is that the historical times have different sorts of meanings, right? So one of the first things we do is make that explicit, right? Time, the ethics of time and place within the work that we do is one of the very first framings that we address. What time are we in? Whose time is it? Whose time gets paid? Whose time doesn't get paid? Right? What time do we do our work? Who's able to show up at that time? Who's not able to show up at that time? Right? So even these notions themselves are ethically fraught. Resources. Very often, we university people often think of ourselves as poor relative to doctors, lawyers, accountants, the corporate world, right? But relative to aggrieved communities that are struggling for justice, we're relatively privileged. And so one of the things we think about from an ethical point of view is how do we convert university resources into community resources? How do we deploy our university resources at the direction of the community rather than us deciding how to deploy our resources, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of fugitive quality because often the universities don't want to share their resources with the community, right? And so we in a way have to kind of steal time, steal resources to make them available. With regards to students, this is a tough one, right? On the one hand, when we're building relationships with community organizations and communities, we have to be committed to the long haul, right? So this is another time issue. How long is our commitment to that community? What's the time scale of the problems that we need to address? If the problems that we're addressing, the poverty, the racism, these are problems that have been shaped over centuries. What makes us think that we can design a program of intervention for a year or 2 years to address that, right? So how do we approach our communities with an understanding of the time scale of the difficulties that they face, the time scale of the research that is required to understand the structural, deeper dimensions of those issues, and then the time scale of the intervention. So students coming into that kind of bigger strategic thing, students come and go. Students may have no organic connection to the place where the research is happening. So how do we handle that ethically, right? Because community organizations are in a way taxed to support the education of the students at the university, right? And so some of the least capable organizations are forced to pay the most. Sounds familiar, right? So we definitely need to be thinking about how do we engage students in this work in ways that do not tax and burden the organization, right? How do we think about the organizations and the people in them themselves as learning environments, right? How are we making our resources available? One of the things I used to do with when CREC, the center that we directed, when we met with community organizations, they would have a day-long meeting. We committed half of the day, they got to decide the agenda. And they got to name what could we provide to them, what resources could we provide to them just for showing up at our meetings, right? And they said, one time they said, we need to learn more about fundraising. So we went out and we hired a fundraising trainer, right? And we did a half-day fundraising training, and then we had a half a day to address our research questions and engage with that, right? So that makes the learning and the skill development of the community organizations as important as the learning and the skill development of the students at the university. That's another one of those equity issues, right? And when you're explicitly addressing the learning needs and building capacity within the organization, then maybe they'll be a little more tolerant of the students who come and go and who sort of poach off of the learning that they get there to build their own careers, right? That's the big danger that has happened so often with faculty members, right? We partner with universities. We go out, we search for partners, right? But the search for the partner is to build our portfolio, right? It's to build our career. And do the university people or the community people even see the results of that research? Sometimes never, even in so-called community-based work, right? So how we think about that is to center the learning needs and the capacity building needs of the groups. Anyway, that's my take on those three topics.
Great. Thank you. I think this question of time and resource use is really critical and interesting. And thinking about it, I was realizing for me, there's kind of three time and resource components in the life cycle of a project. So there's the stuff that happens at the beginning, where I'm initiating a project, I'm thinking about what it's going to be, I'm getting funding, I'm trying to make some initial community relationships to like get in the door and start having conversations. And that stuff happens a lot on my own sense of time and resources, a lot in line with how universities and funders think about time and resources. That's one end. The other end, you have, I'm putting findings out, I'm publishing something, I think I know what I have to say, I'm putting a report out or something. And again, I'm sort of on the time and resources of this institution, institutions like this, funding institutions and so on. In the middle is the most of it. So those two things feel like the things that are in some ways the most organized and accessible to me as a person who is trained in this way. And in the middle is where most of the real nitty-gritty kind of work happens and where all of this stuff gets negotiated. So in that big middle, I'm engaging with communities, I'm collecting data, I'm figuring out what the actual answers to the problems are, and sometimes I'm reconstituting what the problems are from what I thought they were when I started. So that's the time when I think a lot of these power dynamic problems are being addressed as well, and it takes all kinds of forms. And so I'll just give you a couple of examples so you can see what I mean about the time and resources shifting to somebody else's kind of constructedness. So what do I do during that time? I spend a lot of time listening to people. So I initiate conversations and then people talk back to me. But sometimes they talk in ways that are reasonably well structured by, say, my interview guide or something. But a lot of times I'm just talking to people about things related to the project in some broad way, or what they think is related to the project, because now I'm in their community talking about, say, COVID impacts, and they want to tell me about something that I hadn't thought of, right? And they want to do that for months, right? Because we're having a long-term interaction, and they want to tell me people that I need to go talk to that I wasn't intending to talk to. I had a long conversation last month about lead abatement. Turned out to be very much related to something that I was working on. I was not studying lead abatement, but I was studying something else, and the person in the community was telling me that this is necessary. This is a part of how we construct a problem, and therefore how we're going to understand a solution. I spend considerable time recalibrating who the expert is in the room. So I say a lot of to both people who lead organizations, but also to just on the ground people that I'm working with, trying to recalibrate the expectation that those are the experts. The people who are living in communities and living the lives that I'm trying to understand are the experts. I'm here to observe, to learn from them, and hopefully to turn that around into something impactful for those communities in the long run. But I'm not the expert on what's happening there. What's happening there is happening to people who live there. They're the experts, and I'm there to learn from them. People, get that, and of course are very willing to take that role, but it takes time to create that expectation. And I also spend time telling people, admitting when I'm wrong, which is a lot, because I frequently ask a question that isn't the right question, or isn't phrased in the right way, or I interpret an answer when I feed it back. Okay, I hear you saying blah, blah, blah. And the person will tell me, not really, that's not really what I was trying to say. And then I have to say, okay, now I hear you telling me I totally got it wrong. Let's try again. Explain it to me again. And those things are super helpful. This is where I get to the most meaningful products of the work. And when you look at the other end of what papers came out of it, this is where a lot of the insight's coming from. When you look at what interventions did we design, that's where it's coming from. That stuff's not in the grant proposal. It's not in I don't know where to put it in my dossier. It's not, it's not the stuff that's working on our time and resources. The only other thing I'm just going to add on this is that sometimes it's kind of the flip side where, I don't know if this is a flip side or just different. I have often found that communities need results quicker than I can create them. And that what that means is that I need to think and be more creative about what the results are that I can produce, because I can't produce the kind of results I'm looking for any quicker than I can produce them, but I might be able to produce something else. And that something else can vary hugely from let's do a quick and dirty community-oriented report of findings that would not be anything like what I would publish, but is what they want to know now. But it could also be that I've walked into a community and exposed some kind of skill that I have that I can now offer to something they're working on, right? So in Cleveland, we're now working with a woman who's helping the city councilwoman do a strategic plan for this neighborhood. I'm not there to do a strategic plan for the neighborhood, but I have skills she needs, and she doesn't have anybody else to do those. And it's more of a reciprocity thing that advances the entire enterprise for both of us.
Wow, lots to think about. I guess I'll answer the way that I interpreted the question. One of the questions was, how do we engage in this work and have the university recognize that work for tenure? The other one was, how do we train others in this work that we do? So I'll just answer the first one and connect with what Ron said, that we are in such privileged positions to investigate questions that are important to us, that that's our job, and train others in that work. So I think that it's important to recognize how amazing this position is, that we get to understand our world, make sense of our world, and partner with others to help make sense of that reality collectively. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important to think about how we, and just circling back, how we enter into the relationships with others. in order to answer the questions that are important to us and that might also be important to them. So over my career, the questions that I've asked and investigated have morphed and changed based on the relationships that I've entered into. We impact and are impacted by others, right? I think that for so long, positivist research has said you need to exclude your subjectivities, your positionalities. Who you are cannot be part of the process. And I think by stating that, we're stating that what we bring, the family, the communities that have helped to raise us, should have no bearing on the work that we do in order to engage in generalizability, reliability, all that stuff, right? I've argued with others, Valerie Kinlock in particular, toward projects in humanization, which is stating that our subjectivities, positionalities, as we enter into these relationships, they matter. Our stories matter in connection to the stories of others. And so rather than hiding that from the analysis, rather than hiding that from the interpretation, we have to be forwarding that. How we came to the relationships, how we came to the questions, how we came to the study is crucial and important. Who we are is important. And so as far as the tenure process goes, when I work with students, the students that I advise, I say, what's your why? Like, why are you here? What do you hope to understand? And if that why is disconnected from their communities, from where they're from, I think that we need to have conversations about whiteness, about white privilege. I think that for other students, we need to engage in unlearning so that they see that their knowledges, their community knowledges, their cultural knowledges are brought back to the center of what we're learning and how we're understanding. And so I think I'll move to the second question. How do we train others in this work? For me, my teaching and my research and my service are all intertwined. I can't separate one from the other. And that's important for me because I'm in education, right? And I'm training teachers and I'm trying to understand better schooling practices for others. And so I engage in that work by developing relationships with my students, by asking them their whys. But the students that I advise, I think it's important to talk about the importance of reflexivity, of how they are operating in the world. There was this term that I just read this morning called epistemological cataracts. And essentially, epistemology is discovering what is known or unknown and how we understand our realities, the lenses that we put on and how it makes things clear and unclear based on our experiences and lived realities. But epistemological cataracts is that sometimes we have these blind spots that we cannot see outside of our own lenses sometimes. In order to understand those blind spots, we need to enter into conversation with others so that we understand their realities to similar positions, to similar questions, similar realities. And so I think understanding and being aware of our positions, of our subjectivities, and offering spaces for us to make sense of how others' realities are helping us counteract the epistemological cataracts, to help us see a broader spectrum of our world, is essential when I work with students in shaping, who they are becoming as a scholar and as an educator in the world.
So I said that I was going to ask one more question, but there's 15 minutes left, and there's so many people in the room. I want to give you the opportunity to ask your own question. So raise your hand if you have a question to ask, and we could bring a microphone to you. Yes. I think all the way in the back.
Wondering what advice,
Into the microphone, please.
I was wondering what advice you have for making this more collaborative and equitable approach to research that you've discussed legible to institutions that expect more formulaic or positivistic grant proposals in order to garner funding, or for research statements in order to have a chance at jobs?
I know the floor is open, so if
wanna-
please give some advice to us about how to sell this.
So I think that there's a variety of things. So first of all, we can make an argument that collaborative community-based research is more rigorous than traditional forms of research, precisely because of the epistemic warrants that come from different kinds of knowledge holders, right? And so I like this notion of sort of really contesting the notion of expertise, which we do, and paying attention to who holds knowledge. But the rigor of collaborative research, we can argue, is more rigorous than other forms. We can argue that it's more relevant. Take Tim's points from the tribal communities. They're looking for relevant research, right? So we can say one of the big issues in research, this often happens, say, in education, is people say, we do this great research, but then how do we get the word out there, right? How do we have an impact on policy? Well, when you're doing collaborative community-based research, the very process of the research is building power. It's building capacity to impact policy and make a difference. So we can argue that this form of research doesn't have that gap to cross, right? Because the research is already grounded in the development of transformational practices and policies. So by arguing that community-based research is more rigorous, it's more relevant, it has more reach, then we can address the foundations and stuff on their own terms, right? So we can refuse the kind of dichotomy that they make between the ethical and the epistemic, right? As we've seen, as Tim was pointing out, the epistemological issues are also ethical issues, right? And so again, instead of sort of being pushed away by the demands of the funders, I think we need to address them directly and take them on and challenge them about the way they position this research.
I'll just add, the first thing that came to mind, you said rigorous. I thought necessary, that like some of the, I 100% agree about the more rigorous, but we could also make an argument to funders that, if these are the criteria for an appropriate methodology and that criteria cannot be met without genuine community engagement, then we need genuine community engagement. And if, like in my field, if the point of a certain kind of research is to generate an insight about where the right intervention might be in order to change an outcome, and we're going to get to a crap intervention unless we actually ask community members what's really happening there in a way that allows them to really tell us the truth, then we've made the argument that it's necessary to do this work in order to achieve the scientific objectives. Right. The other thing, I just want to sort of, recognize the dissonance in the question, and in my experience, right, is that I think I would be disingenuous if I sat up here and said that I know how to do that and that I do it all the time. I don't. There is a lack of alignment between the ways that I embody this work on the ground when I'm in community and the ways that I talk about it to a funder or a journal, a good proportion of the time. And I would like to be moving in the directions that you're talking about and making those types of arguments that are more like head on, let's take this down and value these things and fight for them to be recognized for the value that they have. But also in the forging of a career, there is a certain amount of challenge to that. And maybe some traction to be had from also knowing how to use the language that's expected and then traffic between them a little bit. And that there is still a certain amount, maybe this is an in-between phase of a historical moment or something, but I do think that dissonance is still there for a lot of us, and it doesn't mean that we're not really trying to move in that direction. It means that we can't just kind of go whole hog, or we feel that we can't at the moment, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah, if you don't mind. I don't have a whole lot to add. I'm just really connecting and resonating with what you had, especially about the dissonance. I think we need to pick our battles in understanding that institutions aren't able to see the brilliance and beauty of the work that we do in partnership with community. But I think what really struck with me is it's so important and crucial to say we're not able, and you said it too, that we're not able to do this work without community partnerships, without that methodological structure, then you're not able to answer the question. And I think that there's a lot of scholarship that's out there that reveals these benefits, that shows that you can't do this work without collaboration. You can't do this work without consideration of the people that you're working with. And so find that work, cite that work heavily, and make the argument for that. I think the other thing that I'll say, and I guess this connects with how do we train others in this work, the previous question, I think it's really important to, in your training as a student, to understand what's being said on a particular topic, but also what's unsaid. Like when you're reading particular work, what's really connecting with you, but also what doesn't fully fit your understanding of reality. And make sense of that. Create a journal, create some sort of reflexive journal where as you're understanding, a particular subject that you're entering into, that there might be something within the literature that's missing, a gap in the literature that doesn't fully fit what it is that you're seeing and coming to understand. And I think when we understand and realize those gaps, that's sort of where our scholarship can flow and funnel into. And when we understand and show that there's a need to understand a particular question or a particular gap in the research field or subject that we're looking at, I think it's a lot easier to ask, I guess, permission or ask for funding to engage in that work with others.
I want to just sort of add the institutions change slowly, but they do change, right? If you apply relentless pressure. I think about when the Center for Collaborative Research for an Equitable California was funded in 2008, 2009, and we tried to talk to the National Science Foundation about this kind of research, the Spencer Foundation, which is connected to the National Academy of Education, William T. Grant Foundation, which is the other really big education research funder in the U.S. They were not interested, right? They said to us, maybe you could help us understand whether this research is any good. Is this good research, any of this, or is this bad research? We don't know how to evaluate this. We don't know how to evaluate proposals. We don't know how to tell whether one proposal is ethical in their relationship with the community and another one not. So can you help us understand that? Well, now here we are 12 years later, right? 13 years later. The Spencer Foundation just had me there, right, for their 50th anniversary celebration. And what are they going to be funding? Collaborative, community-based research. They want to be addressing issues of equity and race, right? William T. Grant Foundation just published a blog by me and one of my collaborators on community perspectives on this research, right? And they're launching new initiatives to support this. So, and universities themselves are starting to examine the issues of tenure and promotion and ways in which the standard approaches to tenure and promotion get in the way of doing this kind of research because of the length of time it takes to build and establish relationships and so on. So there's work being done on this, and there are people, I think of Nancy Cantor, who's the president of Rutgers, and who, when she was president of Syracuse University, brought this kind of work into the tenure and promotion process for the whole university. She's been doing that at Rutgers. There's the Imagining America initiative, which is a consortium of about 110 universities, which is looking at how to bring the arts and the humanities into collaborative research with communities. And they have proposed a variety of tenure and promotion criteria. So just like we can evaluate research from the point of view, the standard point of view, in terms of the excellence of the journal, citations, things like that, well, we can have community members evaluate the quality of the research that we do. This is standard in the arts, right? It's not seen as something outside the norm in academia in the arts to have expertise from outside the halls of academia itself make some judgment on the quality of the academic work. Well, why can't we do that with community-based work, right? Where the communities themselves are identifying, is this helpful to us or not, right? Has this addressed our research needs or not, right? So why can't we, when we go up for promotion and tenure, in addition to soliciting outside letters from other researchers at other universities, why can't we solicit letters from community partners and from others who can evaluate that? Right? So I've had the privilege, because I've been identified at the University of California, I now get asked sometimes to make judgments about that, right? So again, things move really slow. Don't give up, right? Don't think that you're not having an impact when it just seems you're going crazy, right? And just banging your head against the wall all the time. Some of us have very hard heads. And even very hard walls, we can make little dents. We may get a bloody face while we're banging our head, but, don't give up.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to end with that bloody image of researchers banging their hard heads against very hard walls. Thank you so much. Or fortunately, because it was actually a hopeful image. So thank you so much for coming and for being here for this very short hour. And thank you so much for the panelists for sharing all their thoughts. I learned a lot.